Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you all so much for joining today. Over the past few weeks, Jay has been at our UX offices, spending a lot of time with people from DoorDash and Meta and Apple and Google, LinkedIn, and all of those types of companies, and looking into new tech strategies. And luckily for us as the team, he's been sharing some of those insights along the way, whether it's kind of in an SMS or through meetings. But we thought it would be a great opportunity to share what he's learned and the work he's done with our tech community. And that is what he is going to be doing today. The session is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube, because there's about 6 weeks worth of experience and knowledge that Jay has to get through. I think rather than doing questions as we go along, it would be great if we save a bit of time, like 10 minutes at the end, for questions and comments and thoughts. So if you do have a question, please just kind of pen it down and remember it, and we'll get to it towards the end. So yeah, thank you everyone. And Jay, take it away.
Thanks, Mandy. I think what I'm going to do is give you a glimpse of what happens every year with us. Because we're a product business and we keep validating that we are doing the right things for the right reasons and solving problems for clients that get enormous benefit, it means that we also need to be very aware of where our R&D roadmap is going. Our product roadmap is well defined, but as new ideas emerge and new technologies become available, you need to capture those at the right moment when they are going to make an impact. The reality is that a lot of what's happened in the last 20 years in tech still relate to some generics that must work. So your data pipelines must work, your security must work, all of the things must work, but there's quite a big shift in how technology is built and how people are applying it. And that's really what today's story is going to be about. So what I want to do, let me just share my screen. I've got an outline of some of the concepts that I think will be worthwhile to show. You all should see movements in technology.
Got it?
So one of the fundamental things that became very visible is that the real-time scenario and the ability to serve humans with technology is an easier cycle of not just building but delivering tech that is useful is going to be something that we see come to the fore in the next couple of years. The AI movements we've seen in classical chat environments and tools have emerged. All have now kind of got into the household, it's got into the companies that we live in and work with and operate, but we don't quite know how all the algorithms are going to change how companies think about what they do and what they don't do. So the basis of this story starts with a word that was probably the number one word on the tip of the tongues of everybody, and that is the word friction and the concept of removing friction. If you are interfacing with a piece of technology, and let's say that it is a chat environment or it is anything that you kind of doing from a, whatever word processing or a classical piece of technology, friction is when you don't know what to do next, when you have to look in a manual, when you have to think like the company that built it. You have to change your entire way of thinking to get things done. And by the time you think of friction in the context of a developer community, is that, every time you have to rewrite, rethink, redo, remember syntax, speak to a user and reinterpret their requirements, all create friction in the system. The number one priority for almost all the tech businesses that we interacted with is how do you successfully and reliably remove friction from the system? There is a core concept that creates friction. And the concept that creates friction is this thing called cognitive load. The number one priority in any product invention cycle seems to be not just, do I have the right requirements? Do I know the right user? Do I understand the right problem statements? Do I understand, what kind of enablement I'm going to create for a user to use my technology successfully? And can I remove the cognitive load from the person that is going to interact with a piece of technology that I put in front of them? If I'm busy with a certain calculation in a spreadsheet and I want that done for me, I should be able to just get the AI button clicked, I must be able to ask a question, get an answer, and offload a lot of the complexity that is not immediately in my focus. The fundamental part of this storyline is that the priority to remove friction is to understand the concept of cognitive load and the ability to shift that load to areas that are not within your immediate attention. So the question is, how do you then get from friction to flow? And what was interesting about this is that this was interactions with a Microsoft executive who was involved in the tech world for a long time, but dealing with how you handle pipelines and how you deal with execution in getting people to move from one kind of technology to another. So the concept is what's called work slop. And that means that how do you remove the pain and all of the things that you normally need to do that you know that is not necessary? So we've seen that concepts like vibe coding and AI tooling has now completely entered the workplace. So we now know that about 60% of all new tech projects are built by a business person interested in a piece of technology, and 30% of the tech that we see that are going to go into production in the next many years will be built by people who have zero understanding of technological capability. So we now see that this ability to test what was done, to check how things happen, is going to change how we see the world. And that means the way that we're going to drive coding and execution into market is going to shift how we see our world. The basis of this entire, if I think about series of conversations, was around every company is a software company. You cannot say today that even if you operate a service outlet, or you are a restaurateur, or you are somebody that believes that you are not, affected by technology, that you're going to be able to conduct your business without an email, a mobile phone, a spreadsheet, or your accounting environment, or any of the technologies that you are essentially using on a day-by-day basis. So that means bottleneck historically was code, but the bottleneck now is not the fact that code can be written. It is everything else. It is the ability to think clearly about the outcomes and then have the ability to get tooling to do the work for you. Even at places like Google, 75% of code in most part of the periphery of the technologies are generated. We know that at places like Anthropic, 90% of their code is built by AI. We can already see that there's been a radical shift in how productivity is going to affect us, especially going into this next phase that we are moving into. That's what this generically known the San Francisco effect is. You're going to get to a point where, and we already use it in our business, where you deploy whatever the code is that you've built multiple times per day. You cannot use concepts like agile anymore because it's radically too slow for you to think at that pace. So the idea is that, can you surface issues incredibly quickly? Can you deal with the right detail as you solve these problems very quickly? And do you understand how people are going to be using it? So we're seeing that the pressure point is shifting away from the technical capabilities, especially in the generic production of tech, into the user space. We are seeing a number of tools emerge that will assist humans, and especially in the context of a business setting, figure out what it is that they need to do next. I think the basis of this interaction was that lines of code is probably the worst measure you can ever use, because now lines of code just means that I've got a generator who could generate a certain amount for me, and I can get something deployed pretty quickly. So the thinking is definitely shifted in the context of this, what we call friction to flow. So the first interaction to talk about is the Open Source Summit. The Open Source Summit was where a whole bunch of companies presented and individual researchers just their stories. We then discussed in various formats, depending on where your interest lies. My interest was quite specific, based on our business, but where we see a lot of the technology driving commercial success in these products. One of the first areas was to understand the real-time data world. What we now clearly see, and this is from a representative from the IDC, who just said that we are going to see real-time use cases and real-time interactions popping up into every single industry, in every single situation, and especially as more of these technologies get into mainstream. If you are having a conversation with, let's say, a government agent about when you're going to renew your license or what the options are, or you want to be able to speak to your bank about your bank balance and making recommendations to you, or you want to get and understand where that package is that you just got shipped to you, or whatever the situation is, we are going to see that the real-time use cases are going to fit in almost in everything we do going into the future. Even though the slide you see at the top right is from 2022, when they revalidated this, they basically said that everything we see is moving in this direction. So with this, I'm just going to, for the next few slides, show you some of the technical things that were discussed as the basis. The first thing is this event-driven architecture with data streaming. And that means that this enormous kind of shift in focus away from structural and data pipelines and the classical data centers that we used to see, or data pipelines that we used to see with ETL, into real-time accessibility to your, depending on what the data is that you're going to be using. So that means that the issue of how you deal with dual targets and multiple review points that can happen alongside your data points and so on is what almost everybody were really concerned about. And it doesn't matter if we think about Netflix or LinkedIn or any one of those sort of companies that I'll get into in a bit more detail later. We now know that the open source products that fuel the backbone of these companies essentially are now pretty well deployed and very well implemented. So the historical view, and this is an enormous thinking shift in how people have seen the data migration world. If you think of the concept of ETL and extract, load, and transform architectures that have been around for a long time, batch-based workloads with inconsistent data, a lot of data engineers helping out to get data in an environment, the medallion-based data architectures, and all of those approaches are basically being changed into what's called a shift-left architecture. And a shift-left architecture is, how do you get access to the raw data without having to deal with data warehousing and make it accessible to the tooling right at the moment where it's needed, rather than having to deal with a lot of this, classical kind of ETL. Everything is now turned into a stream, into some kind of semi-real-time or real-time interaction. For the non-technical people, don't worry too much about this. All you need to know is that the technology world is focusing on dealing with the technology that's going to help us transform this. So this is an example from a company, Siemens, or any one of the other companies who participated in showing their shift-left architectures. They're moving away from where the consumer has to do data work into that being done by AI tooling as close to the data source as possible. So the idea is that, how do you make all of what you generate in your company accessible to the business people who's going to make decisions on that? So that just means that the whole agentic world, and especially when an agent needs some kind of data decisioning, you're going to want to have some kind of Kafka or real-time feed-based agent infrastructure that can access that directly. And we definitely saw that a lot of people spoke to how this is going to change and how this is going to shift the entire way in which we deal with that kind of data environment. Another discussion that was quite pertinent was the whole concept around unstructured data. And that means that if you want to do RAG-related activity, so retrieval augmented generation, how do you deal with something like emails and documents? And we know that for those who have followed the Microsoft Copilot fiascos and so on, that there's been a lot of pushback around some of these tools not doing what they're supposed to do. So people are designing their own pipelines and creating their own capabilities. The idea is, how do you deal with the embeddings, and how do you deal with retrieval of common areas that you want to search for? The whole what's called context generation is become quite a big topic to understand how you set context for what you are allowed to have access to or not. The basis of this is that there's this technology trend roadmap that is getting us out of this kind of long context model evolution. And idea is to get to this total optimization of pipelines so that you got self-improving systems that can adjust over time, and the agents adjust their behavior based on the learnings that are happening inside the business. We are seeing that structured data will have better, stricter guardrails. The unstructured data will, over time, be put into some kind of automated agent pipeline that will bring all of that together, and that was quite a big focus. The other thing was that everything is into the cycle of continuous batching. That means the static batches of the past, where you might run a daily snapshot or even a few times a day snapshot, is kind of what everybody is moving away from. So that means that the ability to have, even if you're going to do some kind of batching, you want to do it maybe within a few minutes per day, or maximum maybe every hour in a day. So it is changing the entire way in which people think about this. And I know that quite a few companies discuss this in a fair amount of detail. The Airflow story is particularly interesting. We've been an Airflow user for the last many years. In our context, Airflow has been used to do all kinds of what's called a DAG, a directed access graph. They've transformed their core pipelining environment into an agentic-based capability. Companies like Google and others have embedded it in their cloud infrastructure, and very big focuses at the moment on how do you get these tasks to perform automated actions. You can use Python tools to access your existing APIs and the like. So that means if something happens and it goes wrong, can you have automated human-in-the-loop based operators? And can you do a breakout into an email or a text message and let somebody act on it? And the Airflow team did a lot of work around retooling the entire kernel to deal with this successfully. The other part, just to get back to the streaming scenario, is that they've updated a lot of their core capabilities to deal with message queuing and other kinds of capabilities so that you can have real-time feeds from, let's say, Kafka or other environments, so that the decisioning inside a particular event schedule can be fed by an agent. And so you could have an agent making a decision if it needs to go fetch some data, do some work, do some cleaning, fix something, and then perform the next action automatically. And what you also might end up having is adversarial-based approaches where some of these tools will do the same job 3 or 4 times to know that it has done it correctly. And if it continuously fails, then it will fail. If 2 out of the 3 are successful, it will take the 2 that have made the same kind of decision. So there are different approaches that are being followed. The other part of the story is how do you, especially in the AI world, think of model context protocol related APIs, and that means the ability to deploy your APIs and your tech in your business and making them secure. Station is a fairly new company founded on that security thinking as to how do you make these keys secure, and once those keys are secure, can you then wire in some way your deployments without having those keys being part of that deployment. So we can definitely see that there is a big focus for companies to figure out how to orchestrate and get multiple agents to function together as a key priority. That's the Open Source Summit. And I think what's nice about it is that, you don't always realize, especially in our business, how much of what we do is impacted by open source technologies. Probably 80% of our core tech stack, if you had to take it end to end, are enabled by various types of open source products. The IBM Watson team, and this was quite a nice interaction, I must say, because we spent time in New York with them. Some of the people there were involved in some of the acquisitions that they've made recently. IBM bought the guys who deployed databases like Cassandra. They bought DataStax, one of the world's biggest database management companies. The reason why they did that is to bring these resilient open source technologies into the IBM fold, and they are big investors in open source tech end to end. But maybe there's 2 kind of key points. The first point is that IBM Watson still looks the same for those who have used it before. It's had this look and feel for a long time. The whole way in which you can build and deploy and get your AI tools to be deployed across, various other companies, obviously not their direct competitors, but they've got their own cloud infrastructure that you can deploy into, or an AWS or some other environment, and you can manage essentially your entire life cycle. But the big one I was particularly interested in was the way they integrated fairly natively with Langflow. So like this Langflow that you see here is if you wanted to use the ecosystem interface with our MCP tools, the one on the far right there, and you want to use a Watson definition or something that's already been built and integrated with your existing tech stack, and you want to call our MCP to get some decisions made or to get additional work made or to get a recommendation done. It was basically the drag and drop install to drop the ecosystem runtime into any of the Watson-based capabilities using Langflow. You could have done this in the context of your enterprise internally in your custom stack. You could have done it on any of your cloud providers, and the ecosystem environment was natively integratable. That means the ability to orchestrate various workflows is quite a big focus for that particular interaction. A lot of other things happened in the context of that series of workshops, but let's not get into more detail on that. The other one that was particularly interesting to me was the N8N crowd. N8N essentially is an agent-based, exactly like a Langflow scenario, but they've crafted a relationship network with almost every major kind of public software company. So if you wanted to integrate Slack or any of your email tools, any of your data storage tools like Google Drive into your journey, you can just do it through the N8N environment. It's got a very nice looking front end and everything is integrated. And 11 Labs, in the workshop, we presented their voice agent. How do you create intelligent voice interactions that can be crafted in the context of the storyline? Here's an example of a generic AI agent that can be configured. You can have an AI agent conversation and influence how you deal with memory and buffering. When the agent has done its work, you can push out a message to Slack or other environments. So their whole integrated story in the N8N ecosystem was particularly compelling. I don't have the example here, but via the ecosystem MCP tooling directly into the environment was straightforward and quite easy to do. The whole voice agent interface is busy changing quite significantly. And that means that, bidirectional or multidimensional interactions, so that means multimodal based conversations, is definitely a part of what we see playing out into the future. Anyway, the agent here was configured to do that. Okay, so that was essentially a series of conversations and discussions and architectural reasoning about how all of that is evolving. So the QCon kind of interactions and the workshops and the event, especially for me personally, was interesting because I went through the architectural certification programs. I worked with a cohort on trying to understand what core tech pieces are. So the next few kind of interactions will just give you kind of core notes around what some of these companies are doing. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to work through all of these in a lot of detail, but let's talk through a couple of them. So the one is Akka. And for those who know Akka, it has been in the open source world for a pretty long time. It's part of the Apache open source community, but they changed recently and essentially retooled their entire architecture. Akka historically was focused on how you deal with resilient infrastructure. So that means distributed infrastructure, distributed execution. Turns out that the number one priority to get agents to work is that it needs distributed infrastructure. So the whole idea is that can you re-architect this to drive enterprise environments? So they kind of, claim, and they basically primary claim to fame is that they've been able to deploy agents and their secure environment in a lot of banks and regulated entities. So that separates them, quite significantly from the rest. So here's what it looks like. If you develop a new Akka orchestration, get your agents configured or your streaming, and you'll get your data. How do you run it in a resilient or a semi-resilient cluster where you can execute a number of whatever those agents are supposed to do? That means maybe accessing data, dealing with the security requirements, and all of those capabilities to get agents to work in an enterprise. And then when you operate it, how do you manage it and deal with the developer community that needs to interact with this? And especially when it comes to enterprise level security. And what we found already, what's happened with a lot of companies is that there have been issues with somebody having a private conversation. That conversation gets transcribed. That transcription ends up in some vector store. That vector store is accessible by the company. All kinds of private data gets out, and it's enormously risky. We know that focus for the enterprise AI stack is a top priority. So it was really interesting working with the Akka guys on understanding what they're doing, how the agent journeys work, and how they deal with resilience. So that means that the concept of agents are unreliable is really kind of a big topic that I think everybody really wanted to get their minds around, because after about 16 or 18 months of enormous pressure on the market to adopt agents, we now know from the most recent study that about 10% of companies have been able to successfully implement their agent-based projects. So we know that there's a significant gap between the promise and the possibilities and where it's at from a thinking point of view. And that's why you see that companies like these focus on, how do you deal with the complexity, the fact that you can't trust it, and the cost that at the end of the day is an enormous inhibitor. Because by the time you burn millions of tokens to get jobs to work, the cost of your compute just goes through the roof, especially if you can't get this kind of stochastic-based environment implemented for the solution that you want. The idea is that zero trust and all of these capabilities from a security point of view have now kind of raised its head as a bigger priority than people initially thought. So this was particularly interesting around this understanding, this real big complexity around the enterprise and how it deals with all of its different aspects in handling this. Okay, so the next one is on MongoDB. And I've got two pieces of MongoDB in this feedback, and the one is around disaggregated systems, and that means the ability to deal with a lot of distributed data and where that fits. And I think the big thing about the Mongo story is that the document model and the model that was essentially popularized, where you don't have complex SQL design or database design capabilities needed, is still something that is a vision for a lot of what we discussed in our workshops. The big thing is cloud economics, where you decouple compute from storage, because storage is pretty cheap. The move from solid state into more dynamic memory-based storage and retrieval environments is changing the kind of economics enormously. So at the moment, if you want to run a very big GPU cluster or a compute cluster, the cost is there. But if you run, let's say, a MongoDB environment, the cost compute benefit is disproportionately better than what you would get in a lot of the kind of SQL environments. So the big thing here was to say, is there a way that you can reduce compute, increase storage, and have highly resilient and very fast executable environments without having to deal with the classical complexity that you used to deal with in the context of the historical way of SQL-based databases. Okay, let's shift gears slightly into something that we're all interested in microservice platforms. What was quite surprising to me is that we've been using microservice architecture since the beginning of time in our business, and even in my previous life, the whole kind of beginning of the REST movement, and in the way in which you would deal with any representative state-based environment has been around for a while. But the big part was, how do you create team topologies, and how do you deal with the complexity of turning infrastructure into code and data into code and application into code? As soon as you start making your existing inventions accessible, the microservice world has become the primary way in which people achieve this. And I think the reason why MCPs are being adopted by so many people, the Model Context Protocol standard, is because you can leverage your microservice infrastructure and make it accessible so that an agent can automatically figure out which service is best for the task at hand and go perform it if you've designed your microservice architecture properly. So there was definitely, with everybody that I interact with over the last 2 months, really just this enormous new focus on making sure that your headless architecture, that your microservices are well documented, well described, predefinitions are done, validations are done. By the time an AI agent interacts with it, it essentially breaks everything downstream. So it is definitely pushing the attention pretty strongly into this. So that means that the rethinking of what platforms are and where they fit, and how you deal with the issues that normally sit there was a pretty big topic. The other thing is that the concept of services first, platforms later, created a lot of discomfort for me personally. I'm a platform first person, so I kind of always think that if something is well architectured and there's a place where your services fit, you'll be able to migrate and evolve from there. But it definitely seems that the thinking in many places now is that I don't care how the job gets done, I don't care where it gets done, as long as the way that I access it through whatever that service is reliable, then whatever is behind the scenes makes no difference. So I kind of buy a little bit of the story. So I was a bit worried about some of it, because the concept around the thinnest viable platform was an enormously debated topic. In fact, we had conversations, a few rounds of these things, and I could clearly see that there were these two camps developing in the conversation. So that means if you are a person that comes out of a world that built resilient, reliable systems, then the thinnest viable platform is pretty scary. But if you're a person who deals with customer focus and immediate use cases and reusability, something you'll worry about later, you want it to be thin as possible, easily accessible, to break and change it whenever you need to. You don't have a long-term focus. So there's definitely these different ways in which the technology is evolving, and especially the thinking around this, that was a pretty eye-opening set of scenarios. So the other part that was interesting, and I don't have it explicitly noted here, is that there's this huge debate around how useful reusability is. In the tech world, we've been agonizing over reusability since the beginning of time. And there's basically this view now that it's easier for you to copy the same line of code 10 times than for you to try to figure out making it available once and then dealing with the impact analysis later on. So there definitely seems to be a radical pushback against this overly disciplined, hierarchical, reusable mindset that comes out of at least a generation where I come from in software engineering. One of the cases that kept up being referenced was one where if you have a user interface where there's a certain validation being done, and let's say that it uses a backend service to do all its work, then all of you are focusing on now is the fact that there becomes a single bottleneck that nobody can get their job done unless one person gets their particular area solved. So the idea then is that why not just let people rebuild the code? It's quicker now, and especially with AI, you can generate it as quickly as you need to, and you then make reusable what is absolutely necessary. That has been quite a big shift in thinking, especially through those series of unconferencing. And you all know unconferencing. This means that we've got maybe 10 top engineers from different companies discussing what some of the details are. So now let's talk about one of the topics that, like this, thinnest possible layer. So platform engineering is now the top priority. And that means that the thinnest viable platform can only be designed if it's engineered from the ground up. The eBay team presented a particularly interesting story. And I think that, they were essentially giving a lot of anecdotes around why, they had a lot of these things not work for them, that I thought was particularly interesting, because there was this massive focus on saying that the organizational culture is your biggest risk when it comes to trying to get platform deployed. And the idea is that it's easier sometimes for people just to hack it, change it, rebuild it. And that's why you really need to think about how you make it as thin as possible. What I did like about this is the conversation around the pathological management structures that often exist in tech companies now that have grown very big and bloated over time. Is that you sit, there was a time when a startup might have had, let's say, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, developers, and now you sit with 13, 15, 20, 50,000 developers scattered all over the world. So what happens is there's this enormous culture of fear. You only measure based on what kind of code you write or what kind of work you do. If you think about what happened with Twitter when Musk bought Twitter, the first thing he did was people had to submit their repos to him. They ran an internal analysis. If you did not have any code submitted to a repo in the last month, you got fired on the spot. If you submitted code in the last month, how many times did you submit it? What updates did you make? Your relevance is entirely measured based on your output, where historically it was more around who you knew and where you fit. So I think that this culture around, I don't care who you are, what you are, where you are, but you need to produce an output is kind of the reality that played out here. And that meant that this top-down, bottom-up, and middle-out, especially for the larger companies, was a big challenge. I don't want to get into more detail here, but it was definitely a big focus on transformations and how you change. There was a kind of feeling that sometimes it's no point transforming. It's best just to get rid of. If you want to change your organization, get rid of anybody that doesn't come along with you. There will be people interested in dealing with your new future. The people who don't want to come to the new future, let them go find something where they fit. That mindset was a very strong San Francisco discussion. You can see that, even in Seattle, Microsoft and the like, and in San Francisco, thousands of companies have laid off huge numbers of people who are not coming on the AI journey with them. One of the conversations was that if you make a decision not to participate in building some of your tooling with AI, you were given a 7-day opportunity to figure out how to, and if you don't, you get sent a letter that you don't fit in this business. So that disconnect between the vision of where executives see the productivity and where companies are adopting it was a very vivid and distinct conversation in almost everything that we engage with. This is just around how we live our lives. And what I have found, what was fascinating, kind of more so than before, and I think it's because you got kind of a new generation of developers coming through from a different way of thinking, kids who have grown up, with internet and mobile and new gaming and devices and so on, that there's definitely a renewed view on psychological well-being. And that means that, trying to understand that you work for a good place was a central theme from the beginning when we think about cognitive load. The culture and the way in which you deal with your relationships in your business was definitely, I must say, it was far more prominent than in the last couple of years. And so that means this year it's definitely become far more important. And that means getting people to understand that their decisions have consequences. The fact that the consequence of you using an AI to generate a piece of code means that you are still utterly and totally accountable. You cannot blame the tool if you've made a mistake. So the thing is that what is for me, what is for the business, and that the whole thing around hidden decisioning and knowing exactly which problems to solve, where to solve them, and what decisions to make was for me particularly interesting, just how many people were so focused on that. Okay, so let's change gears and look at a couple of core companies. I know that, kind of pressed for time, so I'm going to go through these quickly so you can get a feel for this. The Anthropic team was intriguing because it's great dealing with startups at the forefront of new generative development. It's almost like you get into one of these teams because you, by default, have got a disagreement, a discourse, a dislike for the status quo. You want to not do what is currently being done in the software world. What was interesting for me is this, what they call lessons from their first agentically accelerated software project was that 90% of the code written in the Claude Code tool was done through their own AI. So while building the AI tool, the code that was generated to create the AI tool was generated by the AI itself and the human orchestrated. That means most of the commercial tech you're going to see in the foreseeable future, a disproportionate size of that code base will be done automatically. So that means it's going to create a very strong pressure point onto the people that architect these environments to make sure that they get out. So the question then is that, once you ship is the only time you know if it's going to be good code or not. So that means getting it to work, getting people to apply it means it needs to apply. And if you think about products like Cursor and so on, it was the blinking cursor that was the inspiration. Think about the Cursor interface using a lot of the Anthropic tools like the new Claude Opus 4.5 and all of those new tech that has been deployed. But it was quite interesting. So the bottom line was that spending time on making the coding experience developer friendly. One of the key takeaways for me, and that means that if we move into a world where huge percentage of the business community can generate their own tooling, we need to make the layperson productive using the tools that we provide them with. And that was, I think, probably the number one product strategy discussion across almost everybody that we spoke to. And that means that, you need to find approaches that make that experience of the developer, and the developer means that it could be a kid at school, it could be a granny, it could be somebody in business, it could be somebody wanting to do a job. It's essentially the core replacement of the concept of the spreadsheet with your ability to have a linguistic capability and get a system, an approach to generate everything that's needed for it to work. Enormous focus across the board from everybody. All right, so you think of how you interact with systems. And because of this new way of thinking, this new way of reasoning, the number one priority, it seems, by almost everybody is to get away from this monolithic front-end scenario and to get into what's called micro front-ends. And micro front-ends means that, and this is from Luca and the teams at AWS, and I spent a bit of time with Luca, we've done a lot of work in this space. But how do you get away from the monolith into a front end that can evolve and change and be focused on a subset of what a user is interested in at a moment in time, so that you could fragment the same way that we fragmented the microservices, fragmenting the front ends too. So the idea is that instead of having the single place where you go do everything, you've got these specialist tools that are being deployed. That's what you've already seen in the likes of Microsoft with Azure. A lot of their tools are being fragmented, and the front ends are being fragmented alongside with it. So there's just a whole lot of thinking that goes on in how you need to do that and how you're going to build apps in the future that are multidimensional, that they must all talk to each other with the same look and feel, but they're vertically maintained so that the one does not affect the other. That means the monolith, like in this case, a shop team and a front end, a back end, a microservice, you now have these vertical slicing. And as users start generating their own systems, you're probably going to find that these kind of vertical implementation are going to be far more important. The only thing I think I have a discourse with is the database and the back end. If you deal with something like a customer or core capabilities that are shared across the base, you're going to want to make those reusable. So that kind of thinking is probably not going to go away anytime soon. Let's look at just a few other companies in quick succession to give you a kind of glimpse of this. And the thing about LinkedIn, what was particularly interesting for me was that there's this enormous focus on personalization and the concept of driving a better recommendation. Probably the number one priority was, can we get the recommendations to be real time? At the moment, they're all batch. They're busy working on a real-time capability. They want to make it more dynamic. So the idea is, can you make the user experience unique in the context of how that person interacts? And that's why you will see, because I think almost every business person these days use LinkedIn, that a lot of the recommendations, especially from a content and other point of view, is all trained on batch environments. So their focus is to try to get the scoring and everything to be online to get to the point of advanced personalization. So how do you get to a real-time candidate generation using live signals? We've been on this path now for a couple of years. How do we get real-time features, real-time convergence? How do we get dynamic design capabilities? How do we solve the cold start problem in the moment rather than having to deal with it just as some generic lookup? And how do we get AI to perform a big part of the LinkedIn story? Obviously, taking their existing capabilities and leveraging it out further. Okay, so Meta took a slightly different view on this because they already got a fairly well-defined real-time infrastructure on quite a few of their platforms. So a big part of their kind of, especially their immediate attention in AI is around reinforcement learning. And that means public feedback from people responding to adverts or not responding to adverts. So the whole thing around generative ad text using reinforcement learning was a big focus. If for those who are interested, you can request a paper. I've got academic papers or versions of those that I think I'm allowed to share publicly. Quite a few of them were privately shared that I won't share, but the ones that are public I can share. But the big part of this was to say, how do you deal with the metrics when I'm going to create an advert for a particular human in a particular setting and I want to measure it dynamically? How do I do that? And if I want to create some kind of ad text, can that text be generated automatically by the AI? So far, the results are showing 38% uplift in performance on AI messaging being generated rather than humans. They already see an enormous impact financially on their client base by using their AI tools, even if you use the AI tool inside WhatsApp or Instagram, especially for business purposes. So the big thing that was interesting is that they do a lot of fine tuning on critical text ads and so on. They got a massive focus on making sure that the business metric is one of the feedback areas. We all know that the data in text is enormously costly to prepare. As soon as it's unstructured, the way that you tag unstructured data, the way you prepare it is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And then finally, the only way you know you're successful is to test and to know if it's going to work or not work. The Pinterest discussion was particularly interesting because how do you deal with product placements inside images and what can be done? Some of this conversation was around the Coca-Cola campaign this year, a year or two ago. There was enormous pushback against some of the Coca-Cola kind of campaigns being AI from maybe my generation and the like, but the young people absolutely lapped it up. They are really completely immersed in this kind of content, and it's definitely showing a big discourse in understanding of where this tooling gets used and where it doesn't. So the things like pin landing and the like means that multimodal generative AI is kind of completely built into their capability. What was also interesting is that they've been using Qwen 2, that's Alibaba model, for a lot of the image recognition and the like. So that means if you go to Pinterest and you search for pictures where there's, let's say, a person running that has got a Coca-Cola in the background and, or any part of an image, they are working on incredibly complex search capabilities based on the content of what sits in images. And they're using generative models to extract the components from various areas. Okay, so DoorDash is a company that delivers food and other things in the States. It's been around for quite a while, but what I did like about their story, it's about what's called dynamic moments. It was probably the one that I think was the closest to our entire story and ecosystem. We could clearly see that they were deeply reasoning and agonizing over how they're going to solve this problem. How do you redefine personalization? And how do you use generative models and deep learning architectures? How do you deal with any of this new tech in solving the problem? So that means the concept of what's truly dynamic, moment-aware experiences is top of mind. This is even more so than in companies like Pinterest or LinkedIn. They were incredibly focused on wanting to make sure that the entire product catalog and the events based on your personal life can be matched continuously and reliably, in most cases using a knowledge graph, so that it knows what it is that you're busy doing at whatever the moment is you're doing it in. And then lastly, the whole thing around real-time apps and assets, and how do you take all of what you've created? Like in this case, do you know that the person has got a movie night, if it's flu season, if they're studying, what does it look like when a person wants a snack at 1 a.m. in the morning? How do you get all of those events worked into the recommendation system? And then at the end of the day, what does dynamic really mean? Gain knowledge and deal with this personalization in a way that is reliable. So I know that in our world, we do a lot of archetypal work, and I could clearly see that some companies, including these, have not even thought about that just yet. I could see that we've already started solving some of the problems that a lot of these have grappled with. The big thing is that the static model story is almost entirely going to disappear from recommender systems. That means training models or GBMs did not come up once. Everything is turned into a dynamic model. Everything is in the context of real-time convergence. That whole shift is something that I could see was absolutely fundamental to almost all of these conversations. And that means that if you're going to deal with short-lived, high-intent contexts like events and the like, how do you create the ideal experience if I don't get to know you as a person? I don't need to know other people that look like you. So I just made a note here to say the client ties concept we've been working on really fits very well into this dynamic and product capabilities. The thing that does create a complex pressure point is this implementation challenge. That means the new product layering, the new compound technology structures, the hyperdimensional environments, the dealing with the slow and fast moving, dealing with cold start, dealing with ongoing interactions, dealing with discounting data over time, handling memory, and dealing with all of those aspects are really at the forefront. At the end of the day, you're still going to need, like you see the third point from the bottom there, propensities, and something that can, at a very reliable, explainable way, generate scores that can be integrated with your generative world. It's going to be a very big focus. And for them, that was a big part of what they're working on. Using LLMs as judges to get the decisioning made, all the way through to how do you move away from classical things like Q learning and so on, slow with a cost-based function, kind of calculation, into algorithms that are real-time, a bit like our behavioral algorithms. How do you get loss aversion or prospect theory or that can converge with a quick change in a variable that can shift its entire behavior? Netflix, offline to online, I'm not going to talk much about this. It's just enormously focused on data migration, making sure that people get access to it. MongoDB community, we are big fans of Mongo. So this was really amazing just to see how they've been able to, over time, migrate and get into the way that they operate today and how long it took them to get into this particular space. We also discussed finding the cheapest tokens for execution and scheduling. Coinbase, all about AI tooling, and the fact that they claim almost all of their code is built these days by some kind of automated AI tool. Testing and everything is done with Claude and Cursor and with IntelliJ. Souks, self-drive car algorithms, also productivity, software development, being enabled by tools. MCPs shared in a company that do all the work for you. Intuit built their own what they call Gen AI infrastructure stack. They call it GenOS, and GenOS means that it's got all the internal tooling integrated and all of the kind of capabilities that they've built into it. Airbnb focus on what they call the kind of modern AI architecture, and that means how do you deal with complex search, especially when they are, this hyper accessibility to all of these kind of different data environments. So the use case implementation, what they call the Valky search, means that how do you get the right kind of search with multiple dimensions in real time and get that done incredibly quickly. And then obviously their technology decisions was particularly interesting to us too. Google then, just to close off my session, was almost entirely of my driving change that I thought was particularly interesting. I had 4 or 5 rounds maybe of conversation with the Google people in various places, various products. And the big thing was that what they are seeing kind of, and this is kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Is that as the AI tooling is kind of being blasted into these companies, that the tech jobs are still increasing. So the layoffs that you see in the public is to get rid of the people that are not changing. So the thinking is clearly in these companies that if you are not going to come along the journey with us, we will just remove you and get somebody who's interested. You might end up with 2 people replacing 1, but as long as they're interested in a change and a new thing, they can get going. They presented in one of the workshops the concept called the Jevons paradox. If something becomes cheaper, then more people will use it. Right now, tech has become cheaper, deployments become cheaper, so we see more people using it. Software accessibility is getting easier. The challenge is that if I think about myself, I have to test myself on this all the time. You have this almost continuous incompetence because you know too much about a certain topic. You almost have to forget. You need a fresh mind to assess what you're doing. Making AI more productive, using AI to make you productive was this intersection that for me was also really interesting. And that means that automating continuously is a very, very big focus. When you buy a dishwasher, did it replace the person that was only the one person washing it? No, because now you need to pack it. The people sell you the soap, you run it, unpack it, fix it, maintain it, install it. So that means you created a plethora of new kind of skills and people to be able to maintain that new environment that you are working in. Anyway, that was kind of a whirlwind to give you all a quick glimpse. Probably in total, it started about 2 months ago, preparing ourselves for our kickoff later this year, early next year. In January, we'll be in full swing. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for that, Jay. It was really great for you to take us through everything you saw and learned. The coolest thing, one thing I noticed was when you sent a pic of that self-driving car. I was like, wow, we're really in the future now.
Yeah, well, I think in the city, self-drive cars almost all the time. I stopped using Uber because it was too expensive. You find it depends on where you're going. You don't need to have a driver at all. So.
Yeah. But I know we are over time, but if there's any questions that anyone wants to ask, please go ahead. Otherwise, I think we can close off. Right.